to publishing material that then contributes to a wider conversation about the region. So the region obviously wants to know about itself, but then a part of what's been emerging in the paper so far, certainly also what Craig was talking about, is the need for us to be having a conversation that extends beyond that. History obviously is an underpinning discipline in terms of understanding Newcastle and the Hunter region, but the conversation taking place with scholars at the University of Newcastle particularly, as our next three presenters are from the University of Newcastle, is related to the region as well. And it's important for us to have cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary approaches to understanding the region. So when we talk about a Newcastle Hunter Studies approach, we're drawing on frameworks that have been used in other ways as well to incorporate a range of ways of looking at a region. So the first of our papers in this session, Making Known Chemistry and Identities, is Helen English. Her paper is Music, Power and Public Space, a case study in Newcastle, New South Wales. And I'm going to ask Helen to introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope I'm not going distinctly. Just briefly about myself, I'm a lecturer in music. I work just across the way at the Conservatorium. Have been a music professional most of my life and knowledge academia since the late 1990s. I've been drawn to kind of investigating what music making was in Newcastle in the 19th century, actually through an accidental conversation, as it were, with fine art stuff about Mark Twain's in 1895. And so far I've written co-authored a chapter on the construction of the Victoria Theatre in 1876 and written a paper about visiting entertainment and another one about benefit concerts. So I've now moved on to banding, as it's called, or brass banding, and to celebrate that moment, I've also enrolled in a PhD in history with Carriage. So that's briefly about me. So my research is into 1870s Newcastle and music making, which is quite a difficult period to research. There's a lot to go off. So at the moment, most of my research is based on archival research into the newspapers, the 5 newspapers of the period, culminating in the Newcastle Morning Herald, which commenced in 1876. So a little bit of background, first of all, about Newcastle in 1874, which is the year I'm focusing on today. In that time, Newcastle was a series of townships. Probably many of you are aware of this, but the main ones being Waratah, Lambton, Lambton A Pit. And each town or village comprised cheap housing within close proximity of a mine, with some supporting services such as shops, hotels, school, railway, and meeting rooms, usually in hotels. The Australian Agricultural Company had owned all the coal mining rights in the area until 1850, when after much petitioning and some rival ventures, the field was opened up to any inspectors. Whilst the majority of mines were purely commercial enterprises, there was one exception, the Wallsend Cooperative Mine, which had been set up in the early 1860s. The demographic of the Newcastle region was predominantly British, to an extent not seen elsewhere in New South Wales or the Colonies. The English, Scottish and Welsh were the largest groups, and within the English contingent, a further subgroup from the Northumberland, Durham region of England was strongly represented. This was a result of targeted immigration drives and the sponsorship of additional family members by families already in the region. These migrants brought traditions and cultural practices from their home country. Amongst these were friendly societies, singing and brass band practices, Highland societies and aesthetics. The strong presence of Northern English miners is attested to by practices that within Australia were only found or were very prominent in the Hunter, notably unionism and primitive Methodism. It should also be noted that 85% of this transplanted community was working class with a weak representation from the middle class, comprising professionals, managers and entrepreneurs. The union movement and Methodism both encouraged aspiration and self-development, providing opportunities through schools of art, mechanics institutes, public speaking and committee membership. The theoretical concerns of this paper. The cultural activity represented by the brass band can be analysed from a number of different perspectives. I'll be mainly considering music practice from the point of view of music and space. Music and class and music and respectability are also of interest to this paper. Respectability and class are overlapping constructs for the working classes in the 19th century. As Lynette Finch and Beverly Skeggs have demonstrated about Australia and England, respectability and social worth were criteria used by 19th century sociologists to classify the poor as deserving or undeserving, as someone mentioned earlier. Music was seen as a civilizing pursuit by 19th century reformers who advocated social regeneration through rational recreation. Music practices and performance were therefore important tools for communities to demonstrate worth and respectability. The brass band movement provided, as has been noted by Trevor Herbert, access to collaborative music making that was based on a family of instruments that were relatively easy to master and keep in tune, and could be learned as teenagers and adults. The topic, music and space, is here used to encompass music's power to create social spaces, to evoke memory and identity, and to control and dominate space, and is a topic explored by Martin Stokes in Ethnicity, Identity and Music. This paper will focus on a miners' demonstration in March 1874 to provide a snapshot of the mining community and its bands, from which questions about the bands and their use are explored. On March 21st, 1874, there was a large miners' demonstration that marched through Newcastle, finally ascending the hill to enter the grounds of the Asylum for Idiots and Imbeciles. Well, they weren't most of it. The bottom arrow is the Asylum approximately where it is. There's people here who are much more expert on this than me. And the top arrow is Honeysuckle Station. This demonstration was a regular event, though not historically as harmonious and peaceful as this one. It was in fact a celebration of a recent agreement between colliery proprietors and miners concerning pay rates and dispute resolution, for which it was intended a council of arbitration would be formed. All the local collieries were represented by miners and managers and accompanied by brass bands. After a delegate meeting near Honeysuckle's railway station, the procession through Newcastle began at 11:30 a.m. Large numbers of trains and horse-drawn buses had arrived from early morning, bringing the marching men and their supporters. The newspapers reported on the day in detail, with the Maitland Mercury estimating the number of people as 4,000 to 5,000, almost all being miners and their families. On arrival at the Asylum grounds, the main event of the day, comprising speeches and ratification of the new agreement, took place on a platform improvised from two drays. The new agreement was the result of protracted negotiations and was seen as many as the dawn of a new age. The Newcastle Chronicle commented that this event was a wonderful change from the previous year when there were long and anxious faces anticipating bones and rags. The Chronicle also provides a list of the marching order of the bands. The four brass bands that pleasantly saluted the ear and re-echoed along the neighbouring cliffs were the Burwood, Wallsend, German and Lambton brass bands. The commentary and reports on meetings leading up to the event gives us insight into the value placed on the bands, their playing level and function within the community. More detail has been filled in when the band's activities are tracked from earlier in the year. Of the four bands, the Burwood band does not appear often in newspaper reporting, and the German brass band, also known as the Lambton Amateur Band, is clearly the less proficient of the two Lambton bands. This is shown earlier in the month when, in meetings of various miners' unions reported on in the Miners' Advocate, tenders from two of the bands, the Lambton and German bands, are discussed and accepted. The Lambton brass band requested £12 for the day, whilst the German band only asked for £4. With regard to the Wallsend band, on on the other hand, the Miners' Advocate reported in January 1874 on the arrival of a new bandmaster from New Zealand, one J.T. Morris, previously bandmaster of the Thames Volunteer Rifles in England. The scouting process and enticing over of such a musician speaks for the seriousness of this band and its musical aspirations. The writer in the paper goes on to congratulate our fellow townsmen, the bandsmen, on introducing him to us and their spirit of enterprise in inducing such a gentleman to visit us. These comments suggest that band members were aspirational about their musical prowess, and they had not only the vision to bring about an improvement in their playing, but also the power to effect it. The same band known for the Miners' Advocate is to receive new uniforms in time for demonstration, described as a tunic and trousers in dark grey material with white and silver facings. It's important to note that brass bands were largely funded through subscription amongst the miners. However, later that year, the newly reformed Waratah brass band negotiated successfully with the Waratah Company for funding. Brass bands and miners' activities. During the 1870s, brass bands were ubiquitous. Advertisements, notices, and reports in the papers refer to them at holiday amusements, excursions, union and lodge functions, benefit concerts, galas, and demonstrations. They are sometimes named, sometimes simply reported on as efficient or splendid brass bands. In 1874, for example, the Lambton Band played at the Waratah Miners' Picnic, and the two Lambton bands played in the new year. The bands performed a number of practical functions within the community. Three obvious categories can be readily identified as: 1, entertainment, at picnics, sports days, etc. 2, for specific functions such as providing dance music halls or standing in for an orchestra and theatre performances. And 3, musical support for processions, parades, train excursions, promenades, and openings of new buildings. During this period, there were two types of band: the volunteer military bands and the mining township bands. Township bands in the Hunter in this period are formed by the mining communities, supported through subscription, and it was the miners' unions that paid the bands for their services at the demonstration. So now a little bit about the music. On the day of the miners' demonstration, a train had been negotiated by the miners' lodges to convey brass bands, miners, and their families from Lambton to Newcastle. Judging by reporting elsewhere, bands would most likely have performed on the platform as a prelude to the train's departure, then struck up again on arrival at Honeysuckle Station, Newcastle. Once the procession got underway, it took 11 minutes for the full parade to pass any one spot. And we're just going to take a tiny break here to hear a tiny bit of music played by a much later brass band from Newcastle. That's fine. Yeah, it's fine to play now. So once the procession got underway, we can imagine that from the perspective of the spectator, the bands were significantly spaced out, since it took 11 minutes to pass a spot. Any band passing by would have overridden the sounds of the other bands. However, there must have been a series of interesting moments when two bands were equidistant and the ear received an Ivesan heterophonous experience. Following the procession and meeting, the bands discoursed sweet music, perhaps enjoying the opportunity to hear each other. The use of the bands at the demonstration can be understood in terms of the three themes of music and space, music and respectability, and music and class. The bands clearly supported the various groups of miners, acting as a solid equivalent of the banners that would have carried. But they also spoke to the cultural attainments of the miners. They created a space for the meeting of miners, their families and managers through the performance of familiar marches and melodies. They exerted crowd control, filling in both the physical space and the interval of time before the procession started. Their obvious discipline in performing the precisions of the music, marching in time, and the orderliness of their uniforms testified to the respectability and worthiness of the miners. The use of bands to control and mark out space can be seen very clearly in an event in the preceding month of February. At this time, the working week was still 6 days. Any amusement, excursion, or purchases had to be made on Saturday night. A lobby for a Saturday night train to convey miners and their families from Lambton to Newcastle, which was about 6 miles, had finally been successful, and the inaugural train run took place on February 28th. The event was signalled and then accompanied by the Lambton Brass Band. As the Chronicle reported, Constable Fry is having hard work to keep back the crowd. As it was, 15 carriages were crowded and over 500 return tickets were sold. The Lambton Brass Band paraded the streets for some time previously and accompanied the train to Newcastle. The band would have played at the Newcastle end as well. And the papers report that the train returned at 11 p.m, going on to report the band on alighting played through the streets till it reached Stoker's Corner, which was a place of significance for the community, where after 3 cheers and the national anthem by the band, the crowd dispersed peacefully, only one case of intoxication being noticed. Here we see the mining community use the band to map out their route inside. Then on a return, the combination of a rare outing and the band's music creates a carnival atmosphere. The end of revelry and the return to control and order are signalled through the playing of the national anthem. With respect to the miners' demonstration in March, we see the same uses of the brass bands, but in a different context. First, there is a show of power. The band's music literally takes over the space, filling it with the music of the miners' musical world, performed with the distinctive brass timbres. No other music is mentioned on this day, and there seems to be no competition for the manager's musical worlds. Secondly, there is the music's power, as Stokes puts it, to evoke and organise collective memories. It is the mining community's collective memories, the recent and the more distant transnational, that meld with the living of the present to create a powerful and cathartic experience for those communities. Finally, this experience of an event that is framed and contextualised through their music claims and tames the space, marking it out as familiar, a part of their identity and a memory of the future. Reflection. From the 1870s, an argument for seeing Victorian leisure activities as a means of social control was developed. More recently, social and cultural music historians, such as Dave Russell and Peter Bailey, have argued that some popular music practices, like a brass band and music hall movements, were appropriated and embedded as part of working class identity. From a Bordersian perspective, one could argue that the brass band movement gave working class communities access to cultural capital, since it offered its members entry to a world of brass banding encompassing education, instruments, and an invented tradition, including history, a relationship to its community, and a performance tradition. The important aspect, in my view, for the 1870s mining community was that through brass banding they were able to create their own musical world that ran parallel to middle-class music-making practices such as chamber music and symphony orchestras. The importance of this world to the miners is seen in their raising funds for instruments and band leaders, the imperative to improve standards through an international search for a bandmaster, and the close association of mining communities and bands in public events. The importance of the 1874 demonstration for the bands is shown in the ordering of a new uniform for the Wall's End Band. Uniforms were costly and not ubiquitous until the brass band contests were established from the late 19th century. More common attire at this time was to wear neat suits, as we see here. communities that were linked to their identity in their place of origin. And for a large number from the north of England, this was the brass bands. As John Waratah has pointed out, immigrants from band regions carried a great personal desire to resume banding in their new home. By the 1870s, we can surmise from the evidence of the newspapers that the standard of at least two of the bands was good enough to seek an international bandmaster and also to be invited to play later that year in Sydney. Playing in bands was a voluntary activity, as we can see from the regular disbanding and rebanding that takes place over time, that enriched the lives of the mining communities. The bands reinforced the image of the communities as respectable and worthy. The role of the bands was also about memory, identity, and a sense of place. The implications of the Mountain Brass Band accompanying the Saturday night shopping excursion, providing an enlivening musical route and then marking out a park from the train to Stoker's Hall, the metaphorical end of the line, illuminate this use of the bands. At the same time, an element of crowd control was seen when the band signals the end of revelry. Crowd control, which is also at work in the miners' demonstration, is affected by the band's music. However, there's no evidence that such crowd control was initiated by middle-class officials. Rather, it was the mining communities keeping their own people in line. Beyond concerns of order and pride, respectability and attainment, however, the overriding impression is, as Stokes expresses it, for these transmountain communities to recognise identities and places in what was described in 1875 by the Newcastle Chronicle as a dull piece of coal and scrub.